Chairman, President, and CEO of Evergy. Mr. Campbell, welcome to committee.
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you very much for the time today. My name is David Campbell. I'm the CEO of Evergy, and it's my pleasure to spend a few minutes with you today. Welcome your questions. I'll be joined in the discussion by my colleague Chuck Casely, who many of you know. So I'll talk and open and talk about Evergy's strategy and the investment plan that we have. Turn over to Chuck, and he'll talk about some of our operational metrics focused on reliability, and then our customer pipeline, which is as exciting as it's been in decades. And I will be advancing the presentation, which I know you all have. There's a lot of numbers in there, so my apologies. We all fall back on the material with which we're comfortable. So you'll see presenting slides with a lot of data is how I get comfortable in the intimidating setting of presenting to the Senate. So I will start with a discussion of our strategy, which is on page 3. So when I discuss our strategy, I tend to be very repetitive. We emphasize 3 things. We emphasize affordability, reliability, and sustainability, which are the core tenets that enable our mission, which is empowering a better future and the prosperity of Kansas. We focus on these 3 things, and we always emphasize them, and I always emphasize them in this order. Some folks say reliability first, and affordability and sustainability, because we have the privilege and the obligation of serving all the customers in our territory. We're a very unusual business in that regard. We are a regulated utility. All of our rates are set by state regulators. And if you are in our service territory, we have the obligation and the privilege to serve you. So we have to strike a balance, because what we do will appropriately be scrutinized and analyzed by our regulators. And there's always some tension between these 3. I'll talk a little bit about each. So affordability, a term we like to use in our industry is that we're a relatively small part of the economy, about 5%. But we would argue we're the first 5% of the economy, because most of the rest of the 95% can't operate without electricity. So electricity is core to the economic activity of just about everything people do. So we have to get the affordability equation correct, because we need to enable economic activity and prosperity by making sure our rates don't get out of line. We need to invest in our system to make sure the power is there, so that we can serve all the customers who need to. We need to meet the demand that's out there, but we have to keep rates affordable and competitive to drive prosperity. But we also need reliability. If you ask a customer, they'll typically rank either affordability or reliability first. It depends on when their power was last out. Most people can go about 4 hours without their power on. Depends on what they might have in a freezer, or whether they need to be charging something. But then they realize that electricity is core to everything we do. So we have to get reliability right. And sustainability we define in multiple ways. Part of it is, as a big consumer of water, as a big landowner, as a resource consumer, and an entity that produces byproducts and emissions, we have to be sustainable in how we utilize those resources and how we interact with our communities. If we get out of balance in sustainability, then we also are in difficulty, because we are as deeply rooted as local a company as you can get. Right? Our economy, our success as a business is driven by the success of the region we serve. This is the only region we serve. If we ever emphasize affordability too much, if we really ratchet down on costs and we ratchet down on investment, that can drive improvement in rates over the short term, but that could cause trouble with reliability and sustainability over the longer term if you aren't investing enough in the system. At the same time, if you invest too much in reliability and you say, I'm never going to have an outage, I'm going to wire this system, make it so resilient, so strong that I'm not going to have any outages, well, then your affordability will probably get out of balance. So we are constantly striving to get a balance between these 3 factors. We're not perfect in it, and we know we'll always be scrutinized as to whether we're getting it right, and we appropriately should be, because of the unique nature of the business we run, being a regulated utility and having that franchise that we do. Okay, so I think you all are familiar with our company and our history. We were formed by the merger of Westar, which was headquartered here, and a company called Great Plains, which was the parent company of Kansas City Power and Light. So 2 mid-sized utilities, right next door neighbors, and a big part of the merger rationale was cost savings. So in the last 5 years, the last 6 years now since the merger, we focused heavily on driving those productivity gains. When you merge 2 companies that are right next to each other, you have systems, you have similar functions and departments, you have an opportunity to get cost savings. And I'm pleased to say we've been able to achieve that. So we've reduced our costs by nearly 30% since 2018. As you know, a couple of those years were the highest inflation years that we've seen since the 70s. And notwithstanding that, we've cut our costs by 27% over that time frame. And again, we're unusual in the sense that as a regulated utility, we are able to recover our costs. So if we drive down our costs in our rate proceedings in front of the commission, we will have lower rates as a result of having lower costs. So whatever our costs are, as long as they're prudent and reasonable, we recover them in rates. So when we achieve cost savings, we're able to pass those on to our customers. So I won't be the most popular CEO in the history of this company. It is not easy. It's easy when you do a merger to commit to a level of cost savings, but then you have to go and achieve them. So we've reduced our headcount by nearly 20%, again, because we've had redundant functions in the utilities next to each other. We've been able to accomplish the vast majority of that, fortunately, through voluntary programs, early retirements. And we've also found ways to invest in infrastructure so that we can provide service relying more on automated equipment. There have been a lot of technology improvements. And we've been able to serve our customers, as Chuck will describe, keeping reliability at the same levels or better, notwithstanding doing it spending less. So that's been a hallmark of the merger, of making sure that we can serve what's actually been growing demand since 2018, but doing it with lower costs. So this has been very important to our affordability story, and we'll keep that focus. We've largely, achieved all the cost savings we could out of the merger, but we're still remaining very focused on driving productivity gains and having costs that rise at a lower level than inflation. The ultimate scorecard, of course, is, well, where have your rates gone? So I'll show a few slides on rates that follow, and there's a blizzard of numbers here. The first slide is each one of these bars in each one of these columns represents the cumulative rate change since the end of 2017. So we dated it since just before the merger. The merger was in mid-2018. So the first bar on the left, since the end of 2017, cumulative rise in inflation is 26%. And this shows every state in the region what's happened to average retail rates. This is all in across customer categories. And Evergy, Kansas is the lowest. Now, we'd like these gaps to be even wider. I particularly look at Oklahoma. We'll talk a little bit about Missouri. Oklahoma are the two largest utilities in Oklahoma, both implemented rate increases at the end of 24, one of them in the January 25. So that'll help this story as we go through the year, because those are rolling through now. But of course, all the utilities are going through rate cases at different times. We're in one now. If we go to the next slide, this shows change in residential rates. So we're very proud of this story here. And again, a reflection largely of the cost savings that we've been able to achieve and being able to pass those on. You'll see that Texas has the highest increase in residential rates. Texas is a deregulated market. I actually spent most of my career in the Texas market, so I'm familiar with some of that history. It tends to have hills and valleys. It is not rate regulated. The rates in Texas are the result of bilateral negotiations and market dynamics. So right now, in 2024, at the end of 24, you've seen rates in Texas go up a lot because they've had an explosion of demand. The rest of the states on the page are largely all rate regulated like we are, and you'll see that Evergy, Kansas, again, significantly the lowest level of rate change since the end of 2017. And we're proud of that, but we know that we're always going to be scrutinized. Are we doing enough? Are we continuing to drive? Because, of course, when we had the merger, we had among the highest rates in the region. So we needed to drive this improvement, and we need to stay vigilant because we know that we had a high starting point. Of course, cumulative change in rates, you've got to complement by looking at absolute rates. So the next slide, slide 8, shows a comparison of absolute rates, and this is in cents per kilowatt hour. So we're a very strange business. Most businesses don't charge by the hour. We used to have long distance that was per minute, but we don't even have that anymore. So we charge by the hour. It's a kilowatt, which is a metric system, and a long-deceased British scientist. So we have a unit that most consumers don't think of intuitively, right? What's a kilowatt hour? But in any event, we charge about 14 cents on average for residential customers. So that's slightly higher than the regional average. We were the highest in the region back at the end of 2017. Now, of course, it's hard to move the needle in an infrastructure business like ours when it's rate recovery. So we're moving that needle. We'll continue to emphasize it, but it takes time because you're recovering on investments that typically you make over decades. So to get that rate trajectory improved, you're going to move that slowly. And I'll also say something a little bit about the relationship between average use and rates. So you see that Minnesota and Colorado are the highest. Actually, Justin Grady of the Kansas Corporation Commission, who you've probably heard from in the past, has been very thoughtful in presenting how there's often an inverse relationship between rates and usage. So some of the states that have higher average usage, so higher volume, have a lower rate because they're able to spread costs over a larger base. We have some of that dynamic here in Kansas because most customers really care about what's my average bill, what's the dollar amount I'm paying, which is price times quantity. So the next slide shows what is the average residential monthly bill. So here we're a little below the regional average. We're actually right at the median. And again, we've made significant improvement since the end of 2017, and this reflects that improvement. You'll note the inverse relationship. You actually see Minnesota and Colorado at the far right. Even though they have the highest rate, they actually have the lowest average monthly bill. It's in part because they're spreading usage over, they're spreading their costs over a smaller amount of volume. But the total amount that customers are paying is less. You'll see that some states that have lower rates are actually paying more on an average monthly basis. So Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, they're all paying higher amounts, reflecting a little more air conditioning load in particular. I should note this slide shows Kansas, the overall average, including municipals and co-ops and others. Our average monthly bill is a little lower than this. It's just over $124. So Evergy, Kansas would be at similar levels. So again, affordability, if we ever lose sight of that, you're in a situation where you've got to put a lot of attention on it, just like we've been in the last 7-8 years. It's always going to be first on that list if you ever hear me describe our strategy: affordability, reliability, sustainability. And we're always going to be tracking results like this. And of course, the legislature gets a report every year from the KCC, from the Corporation Commission, comparing our rates relative to others. The data is all based on, we all have to report the data. We're a heavily reported sector, so this is all aggregated by the federal government. But the KCC will also give an objective report on this too. So if I shift to our next topic, it's on reliability. Chuck will talk about some operating statistics. I'll talk a little bit about our capital investment for reliability. Some of you may have heard me make this joke. It's because I'm so excited to be as a utility guy. So I'm my 30th wedding anniversary this May, and for the first 28 or so years of my marriage, my wife said, "Don't talk about your work at parties," because no one cares about utilities. It's the most boring thing out there. And I'd say, "Well, what about insurance? Is that?" But anyway, so I didn't talk about utilities. The last couple of years, it's the glory time for our business. People want to talk about nuclear. They may want to talk about renewables. They may want to talk about, are we building more gas? It's a great time to be in the space. And it's reflected in the need for investment in new generation. And that's because we have more growth than we've had in decades. So it's an interesting time. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the plans we have to grow in light of this historic opportunity, because with growth comes more prosperity, more opportunity, typically. So this next slide is put out. We have lots of acronyms in our space. This is the North American Electric Reliability Organization. It's called NERC. It's overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And NERC puts out reports every year on how does the grid look across North America. And in shorthand, blue is good, orange is elevated risk, red is bad. And the right-hand side, interesting, is showing winter. For the first time, really, in my career, the last few years, we now are starting to plan for winter reserve margins. It used to be the case, if you saw for the summer, you saw for the winter. Now we have enough renewables in the system, you got to look at them differently, because the wind and solar is much less reliable, or expected to operate at different levels in the winter. You'll see in our region, which is called the Southwest Power Pool, it's in that central band in the map. We're in orange, so we have elevated risk. The area in red, which is the upper Midwest, largely, though there's dangles into Louisiana and Arkansas, they face trouble because of early retirements. We haven't had the same range of retirements. There's all kinds of reasons why that's happening in the upper Midwest I won't go into. Our area, the reason why we're orange, because we have demand growth and we have the need for more dispatchable generation. Now, in our space, dispatchable generation means something a human can turn on or off at that person's discretion. So it means that you control the dispatch. So at a nuclear plant, coal plant, gas plant, oil-fired, those are dispatchable. That's as opposed to intermittent resources, with wind and solar the most prevalent, which are dependent on Mother Nature. Now, if you get enough storage, you're turning intermittent into more reliable. We don't have much storage at scale yet. We hope we can get there, but most of the storage you hear about in the U.S. are 4-hour batteries. They're really relevant in hot climates with a lot of solar. They're not so relevant in most other places, not as relevant for us. So we have a need, as NERC reflects, for dispatchable generation because we have demand growth. Chuck will talk a little bit about the demand growth. I'll talk about how we're responding to that need. So this next slide, slide 12, reflects the investment we're making in dispatchable generation, but also in solar. So we're at a period of historic investment. We're excited about that. They tend to come in waves in the sector when there's a wave of demand growth. And what I describe, each one of these boxes represents a plant that we're planning to build. In response to this need, we are investing heavily in new generation. It's predominantly in natural gas generation, and it's predominantly in Kansas. So we have two big natural gas plants I'll talk about on the following pages. Then the central part of the state, two solar farms, and then in Missouri we have a peaking gas unit, slightly smaller in size, and also a solar farm. And I know solar gets a lot of attention these days. The way I describe it is we generate our plan based on the lowest cost integrated resource plan that will reliably serve power to our customers. So we have to solve for reliability, and then we solve for lowest cost. So for solar, with the federal incentives that are in place today, it pencils out. We don't have much solar in the system. Solar correlates very well with the highest demand days when it's sunny outside. So solar makes sense. We'll build it in the places in the communities that support it and where we can get permitted. So that can be challenging in some areas. If we'll only build it, obviously, in places where we can. And we've got a couple of those proceedings that are seeking approval for right now on the Kansas side. But we're excited about these different investments, and we're excited about the potential they bring, given the opportunity we have with all the growth that we see. Regarding the gas plants, the first one will come online in 2029. It takes a long time to get a gas plant built. Partly that's regulatory approval. That approval is pending now, so we make sure we get approval from the commission through a proceeding where many interveners join in and make their case. We think we have a strong case, but that will be decided this year. And assuming that moves favorably, then we expect to be online in 2029. And this is in Sumner County near Viola. It's a combined cycle plant, which is basically, in effect, a baseload gas plant. It converts natural gas to electricity at an efficient rate. So it's something you want to run at a high capacity factor. Tariffs will impact the cost. So I think there's tariff announcements every day. We'll see what sticks or otherwise. These plants cost northwards at current pricing of $1.5 billion. They have a lot of steel, a lot of metal in them. So if tariffs come, they'll, even if and we generally source more from domestic suppliers, but tariffs typically impact the overall market price. So that'll have an impact. We shall see. We also plan to build a gas plant south of Hutch in Reno County. It's also a CCGT, so a baseload gas unit, that we expect to come online in 2030. And we pick these sites because they're relatively well-positioned relative to existing transmission infrastructure, natural gas infrastructure. They both require some additional investment, but pretty modest, so they're well-situated, well-sited. Obviously, great investments for Kansas. They're going to be planning to have them partly serving our Missouri customers. So like Wolf Creek, which was always half-built out of the Kansas City Power and Light utility, that investment's going to be made here on the Kansas side is the plan. So we're excited for these plants, and this one will be online, we hope, in 2030. As I described, it's a really historic time for generation build. So slide 15, the left-hand side shows our current installed generation and more units. So we have 16,000 megawatts. Of that, we've got a nice mix. We are definitely an advocate for an all-of-the-above generation strategy. So use all the generation sources you can. That's the best way to ensure stability and predictability and cost for your customers. You go all in on gas, it's a great thing until gas prices spike. It's very commodity volatile. It's a volatile commodity. Coal can run through cycles that may be more environmental regulation. Every 4 to 8 years, we tend to have a very different regime for coal. We like an all-above regime. We love our nuclear plant. We may come to Q&A about new nuclear, which I hope will be promising. So we like all the above. You'll see, though, in the next, through 2032, we expect to build about 6,000 megawatts. So equivalent to adding 40% of our current generation, about 3/4 of that gas. And that, again, reflects the demand growth that we're seeing and the need for new dispatchable generation. And also, in part, we have a lot of older coal units. Some of those are older. It's like a car you may have. If you have a 10, 15-year-old car, you've probably put a fair bit of money into it. Eventually, it's time to move on to a new car. So in this time frame, some of our coal units are going to be upwards of 67 years old. It'll be time to retire. Might be able to convert some to gas, not run them as much, but we'll like having a little more gas in our system for the resiliency of our portfolio for our customers. And I hope in the 10 to 20-year time frame, you'll see new nuclear in this mix too. I say, gosh, have you ever built at that scale before? You're equivalent of 40% of your installed generation in 8 years. So the next slide just shows 75 to 85, really around the country, but also for our predecessor companies. If they had been combined, they more than doubled their generation fleet over a 10-year period. So when Wolf Creek came online, several coal units, some gas. So we've done this before. So of course, as you would expect, we've set up an organization to supervise this. We've set up the right processes to manage it, assuming we get regulatory approval. And we benefit in our region. The epicenter of the capability to build new plants is in Kansas City. Burns McDonnell, Black & Veatch, Kiewitz Power Division, they're all headquartered in greater Kansas City. Of course, they serve clients all over the place, and I'm sure they serve them all equally well, but it is good to have a little bit of hometown. People like working closer to home. So we need to make sure we have the processes to do this, but we do know how to do it. And we'll do it carefully, and we'll have the right level of scrutiny, because that's the nature of our business. Okay, so stepping back, what does this mean? It means that we've got a lot of capital coming. This is our 5-year capital plan, starting in 25 through 29. You'll see $2.5 billion this year. That's about where it's been historically, so it's increasing significantly. The driver of the increase is predominantly the new generation. So of the $17.5 billion, about 35% of it is the new generation that I described. The baseline of it is about nearly 50% of it is transmission and distribution, which is largely comprised, most of that $2.5 billion is that baseline transmission and distribution. Our system, like most U.S. infrastructure, was predominantly built in the 50s and 60s, to some degree in the 70s. So we're having to do a lot of replacement, but some of that is upgrading and also taking advantage of new technology. So we're investing in all the above in generation. We're also prioritizing transmission and distribution investment to make sure that we can support resiliency, reliability, and also growth, because we do have a lot of growth coming. The T&D will help that as well. Now, you may say, well, gosh, at that levels of investment, will you remain affordable relative to your peers? So another thing that we track is what our relative investment level is compared to our peer utilities. Because ultimately, what drives rates for regulated utilities, there are two factors. One is, or three factors. One is the amount of investment you're making, because you get a return on that investment. The second is your cost, so your O&M. And the third is the amount of growth you have in your system, because growth can mitigate the first two. So just looking at the investment level, this next slide is a good proxy for investment levels, rate-based growth. So that's how much our asset base is growing effectively. We've got a pretty high rate of growth, a little over 8% through in the upcoming years. And this shows all of our peer utilities. These are utilities that we track that are almost all in the central U.S. You've got utilities ranging from Louisiana up to Colorado in our region. And we're just below average for our level of investment. Our cost trajectory has been below average for our peers, so this is a good check to say, hey, we are very confident, if you combine this with the growth that Chuck will talk about, that we can remain rate competitive. Because we know that we'll be watched carefully, and should be, to make sure we remain rate competitive. Because the only way we have the kind of pipeline we have today, being able to attract new customers, is if we stay rate competitive. So we know we need to look at where we stand in this chart. We historically been at the far left. We're glad we're not there, because you might be underinvesting if you end up at the far left relative to peers. And my last slide, because I'm sure you'll say, well, gosh, Dave, you're saying all these great things. Aren't you an investor-owned utility? What do your shareholders think? Shareholders care predominantly about earnings and earnings growth. So my last slide just shows earnings growth for different companies in our space. And if you look across it, the highest is Entergy. That's a utility that serves Louisiana, Arkansas, and parts of Mississippi. They have really high levels of earnings growth because they have probably the highest level of demand growth now. It's a combination of energy, industrial, and a lot of data centers. We're towards the bottom, so our shareholders are, we're not projecting as much growth. We'd like to get competitive at least on this. And there are two ways to do that. One is through investment, so you drive more investment, you drive earnings off your investment. Or the second way is to grow. As I described, we track our investment level, and we're usually going to be a little average to below average because we really want to stay affordable. And then on the growth side, well, that could really help because that can power earnings growth, and we think we got a great growth trajectory. So we expect it will become competitive over time, both through our investment, but primarily through our growth. So sure, we need to be able to attract capital. We need to be able to be competitive with respect to our shareholder return. But we always look at that from that same lens, affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And with that, thank you for your patience with me. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Chuck.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. You'll stay around for questions in case we have some. Okay, thank you. Next, we got Chuck Hazley, Executive Vice President, Public Affairs and Chief Customer Officer for Evergy. Mr. Hazley, welcome to committee.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, members of the committee, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it. I'm going to bring this home. I'm going to be trying to be quick so that we have at least a little time to ask David and myself some questions. So again, just to recap, affordability, very important. You heard David talk about cost reductions, more than $350 million that have been reduced since Evergy became a combined company. One of the things that we don't talk about as much, though, is that's more customers and more electricity being produced. So instead of shutting down a branch or shutting down something like many other companies do, we have more customers, provide more electricity, and are doing it with $350 million a year less. So that goes towards affordability. You heard David talk about investment. We are making significant increases in investment, and that does raise rates, but it is still on the low end relative to our peers. So in terms of being competitive with surrounding states, we're going to maintain that advantage, even though we're investing more in the grid. Why do we invest more in the grid? Well, as you saw with NERC, they say we need generation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about transmission and distribution and maintaining reliability there, because that's one of the hallmarks of why people come to Kansas, come to our service territories, because we have reliable power. And then the final component that I want to talk about today is growth, because growth at the end of the day, even with investment, you are taking more customers and more energy used and dividing the cost of running the system over more people. That means that puts downward pressure on rates. So we want to significantly talk about what does the growth picture look like, and that's what I'll cover today. So first of all, cost cutting with a resulting reduction in reliability is not good cost cutting. It's something that would actually hurt our economic competitiveness, and it would, more importantly, annoy your constituents and our customers. The good news is that since the first full year as a combined company in 2019, our reliability has actually improved. It's holding its own and improving. There's a little volatility to it, depending on what kind of storms we get in a given year, but it's generally improving. Now, that is system average interruption duration index. That's a great acronym for basically what's the average person who experiences an outage, how long are they out, how many minutes. So that's what you see. The top number on all those bars there are the number of minutes that our customers are out if they, on average, if they experience a outage in a year. And as you can see, the average in 2019 for our service territory was about 101 minutes. And it's down in 2024 to right around 96 minutes. How does that compare? Well, in the Midwest, the average is 2 to 3 hours. So we're at roughly half of our neighboring states. If you experience an outage, roughly 50% less time out in our service territory that we serve. And for the U.S., it's 118 minutes. So again, we're below the U.S. average. Now, everybody lives here and knows we've got spring tornado season coming up, and then you got summer thunderstorms, and you get ice storms here. So we actually get a lot of storms relative to the rest of the United States, whereas San Diego gets rain, like 5 days out of the year and doesn't usually have too many windy days. So there is a difference depending on where you are, and the Midwest generally has more outages and longer in duration. But as you can see, we're doing very well. So we cut costs, but we're still doing very well on the thing that people care about the most, which is not being out long when there is an outage. Second thing I wanted to talk about is how are our power plants doing? The first thing I would call your attention to on this slide is the fact that our coal, while it had a really good year in 2023, our coal is getting older. We have a couple of young units. Those are our Iatan units in Missouri that came online in 2010. They're almost brand new in coal terms. And then we have some almost 70-year-old units. And just like David said with a car, once you've replaced the transmission and once you've replaced the brakes a couple times, at some point you say, you know what, it makes more sense to replace this car because I'm putting so much money in it to keep it running that it doesn't make sense anymore. We've got a few coal plants like that. One of the things that is driving increased investment is the fact that to keep these older plants running, you've got to do more. So as we go forward over a 20-year picture, there's probably a plant or two that we're ultimately going to retire because it just doesn't make sense to run them anymore, notwithstanding whoever happens to be president and appointing the head of the EPA or who's running Congress. And if you look at nuclear, well, that is the crown jewel of our fleet. The Wolf Creek nuclear plant has been running for 40 years. It's been reauthorized for another 20 years. It's the single greatest investment our company has ever made. But it's also the plant that, as long as it's not in a refueling outage, is running. And so if you take all the electricity that it's made over its lifetime, it's the cheapest plant in our fleet to run. And again, the crown jewel, 100% of the time minus refueling is what that plant does with zero emissions. And then the other thing I just mentioned on this page is that our fleet generally has held up. So as we're being more frugal about operations and maintenance spending, as we're cutting costs, we still manage to run the whole portfolio of our fleet right around where it was when we first started out as a combined company. And that's good because that's what customers pay for. They pay for those plants to be online making electricity when they need it. And then the final thing, this is an eye chart. I'm not going to go through this. This is crazy, but it just happens to be in my area of the company, so I'm super proud of it. This is our call center performance. We had the single greatest year of answering phone calls and customer service on the phone that we've had since the two companies have been put together. We look at how quickly, what percentage of customers do we get within 120 seconds and want to be over 70% of customers. And we also look at abandon rates, meaning you get so frustrated that you hang up. And we have had very, very good results. Like I said, the best results we've had, that's with fewer people, that's with more technology, that's with less cost. And we've kind of hit our stride there. And so when it comes to reliability of service, despite cost cutting, we're still doing very well. And in many cases, in most cases that are the most important, above the regional and national averages. Now, the last thing I want to talk about real quick is this notion of growth. Growth, as David said, is kind of the keystone. It is the Rosetta Stone of how you take when you're having historic levels of investment, when you've done most of the cost reductions you can do. How do you keep costs low? And that is you grow the number of customers and the amount of electricity used on this very big capital-intense system that we have. The good news is that we have a better pipeline of economic development than I've seen in the last 20 years at this company. It's truly a generational opportunity. Why? Well, we're seeing the onshoring and reshoring of critical industries. That has been a very particular focus, particularly at the federal level, since COVID came around. And so we're starting to see that. And guess what? They're looking at places like Kansas and they're saying great labor, great educated people, lots of land at reasonable prices, and they've got electricity. And so we've got a great pipeline of folks looking here. We also have advanced manufacturing. So that's microchips, that is electric mobility and other things that are also very excited, advanced aviation and aeronautics, all very excited about Kansas. And then, of course, what everybody's talking about these days, even this body, data centers. And collectively, that is an opportunity for load growth and customer growth we haven't seen in at least 50 years. To give you an idea, we've got 5 projects that have publicly announced that are what we would consider mega customers, 100 megawatts plus. Google, Panasonic, Meta, and 2 additional data centers that have all announced within the last 18 months. Collectively, that's 800 megawatts of load. Remember those 2 plants that David referred to earlier, the combined cycle natural gas plants we're building in Kansas? One of those is 710 megawatts. So these 5 customers together are actually larger than the construction of one brand new power plant. It means it takes our base demand growth, which has averaged over the last couple of years between 0.5% and 1%. That's basically residential customers, commercial customers, and indigenous industrial customers. And it takes it up, just those 5 customers, to around 2 to 3%. That's very, very good. If you want to go back to the time period in the 80s and 90s when, our company went for 15 years with very, very stable rates, what you had is 2 to 5% load growth during that time period. So this is a very good sign for the economy in Kansas and for rates generally. Now, the actual numbers of how much these individual consumers are going to use it's confidential, so I can't show it. But those bubbles or those circles on the page actually represent the relative size between the largest customers we have in that part of our service territory today and the size of the new customers coming in. You can see that it's a step change. But this is my favorite slide of the whole deck and maybe my favorite slide of the year. And this is what could be and what is coming in the economic development pipeline for our company and the region that we serve. If you look at the bar on the right, which is the gray bar, you'll see that our peak demand is about 10.6 gigawatts. What that means is on a July or an August day at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, people are still at work, people are still at schools, factories are still running their second shift. That's when the most electricity is used because air conditioning is going on, people are starting to cool their homes, people are still at work, and all the industrial load is on. It's about 10.6 gigawatts. It took us 135 years to get to 10.6 gigawatts. What you see on the other side is just the large load customer pipeline that we have today. And you'll notice that its total is 11.2 gigawatts, meaning that we have economic development prospects, companies who want to locate in our service territory that exceed the peak that we have on the books today. Now, we obviously can't build that in the next 6 or 7 years, but I want to break down what is in that left bar chart so you know what is real and what isn't. First of all, you'll see the 0.8 gigawatts. That's just the 5 companies that I mentioned previously. That's Google, Meta, Panasonic, and the other 2 data centers. We know that's coming. That's coming for sure. Right underneath that, you'll see a lighter blue part of that bar, which is 1.6 gigawatts. These are companies where we're finalizing agreements. That means they've got land, they're moving dirt, they've got engineered projects, they intend to locate here. They're probably still working on a few local incentives. They're probably working on a few other, dotting the T's or dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but they intend to come here. We anticipate they'll be here. That's 2.4 gigawatts just from those customers. And then the green bar is ones where we're in advanced discussion. Again, these are companies who have picked out a place. They own or have an option on the land. They know that we have got the electricity to serve them, and they intend on coming to our service territory. Now, the balance of the pipeline, or the orange, those are folks that are in the queue and we know are interested, but they're further in the beginning, right? We don't know if we can serve them. We don't know what their load ramp is and if we can meet the generation and the transmission and distribution they're going to need. We don't know if they're completely serious yet, but they've come and they've met, and we are at least having a conversation with them. The importance of that is if anything moves out of the green or the 2 blue colors, there's that much left waiting to essentially get in to Kansas and Missouri. This, I should note, represents both Kansas and Missouri, and it's about a 50-50 split right now between the 2 states of where there's interest in economic development. Bottom line is, this is an absolutely amazing time for economic development prospects and growth. Now, it's only good, and this is very important, and I'm going to wrap up here and then tell you a little bit of what's going on for the rest of the year in front of you all and our regulators. But it's only good if we get the rates right. This is something where our friends from the industrial consumers and us and CURB, we agree. This new growth is only good to the extent that we get the rates right and that we protect our existing system and our existing customers. What do I mean? Well, those 5 customers are as big as 1 power plant. That means we're going to have to do more investment to accommodate the additional customers that we see. It's only right and it's only fair for these customers that are coming in to have to pay for the amount of capital that they are causing us to have to deploy. Meaning, in our large load power service tariff, which we just filed earlier this month, there's actually a component of it that says, look, we're going to have to accelerate our capital investment. And for the portion of that that's attributable to you, you should pay it. so that it is protecting our existing customers. It shouldn't be a burden on existing customers. Also, just like Panasonic and others, any direct costs that are caused to specifically serve one customer, they have to pay, and that's reflected in our new tariff too. Now, this is in front of the Kansas Corporation Commission. I imagine it's going to go till around September or October till we finally get this resolved. But the bottom line is, growth is good as long as the companies that are locating in Kansas pay what is fair for what they are causing us to build, and it doesn't become a burden on the existing customers. And that is a place where I believe regulators, existing customers and consumers, and we are aligned, and it's something that we're specifically looking at. That bottom box there is just a whole bunch of other things that we're going to ask new customers that are over 100 megawatts to do. Things like a minimum bill, things like a contract for at least 15 years, 10 to 15 years, an exit fee if you were to leave, so you don't just leave us and our customers holding the bag for a large investment, a written service agreement or contract so that everybody knows what each other's obligations are. Those are all things that in order to protect existing customers and in order to take full advantage of this, that we expect to deal with in front of regulators and expect to be part of our large load power service agreement. Finally, I'm going to skip that one. That just says if you got renewables and you want to, as a large load customer, you want to bring them to Kansas, we'll welcome you to bring some of your generation, and we'll figure out how to deal with that. What I'd wrap up with is there's really 4 big things that we're focusing on for the rest of the year. First of all, as David mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure you know, we have filed in our Evergy, Kansas Central Service Territory, which is the Wichita, Topeka, Lawrence, Hutch area of our service territory, we have filed a rate increase request. It's about 8.62% over what rates were in 2023. And but the good news is that if you take this over the time period that we've been looking at, which is 2017 to when this comes in, we're still well below inflation over that time period. And Iowa, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri all have their major utilities in for single and double-digit rate increases at the same time. So it's not going to hurt us relative to the other states and our rate competitiveness. In fact, I don't think there's been one time in 20 years that I've worked here that we've gotten our full request, and so it's probably not even going to end up being that much at the end of the day. Second thing is we've got natural gas and solar predetermination cases. That means we're going in front of the Kansas Corporation Commission and asking permission from them to build the plants that David talked about earlier. Obviously, if we're going to accommodate this load that's coming in, and obviously to maintain our reliability, we think that's very important, but we got to make that case, and so that's a proceeding. We just talked about the large load tariff that we filed and are hopefully will have done in the third quarter. And then finally, I know in front of this committee and hopefully soon in front of the Senate as a whole, we have our wildfire legislation, and that comprises the balance of kind of the state government related priorities that we have in front of this body and the KCC to effectuate our strategy. So that's an update as to where we are. I really appreciate your time. And now, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Great presentation. Committee, we got any questions? Senator Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the briefing, David and Chuck. I know this is an investor call, but how leveraged is the company? Can you give us any feeling for, I know you had a sort of a merger and there were costs playing out from that, but where are we at today?
So we have rules on how we capitalize our business also. So we've got, it's in a confidential settlement, but what's authorized in rates, but typically we have about 50% debt, 50% equity, maybe 52% equity, 48% debt at our operating utilities. So we about 50-50, and that's regulated, authorized by the state. And we have a little sliver of holding company debt on top of that. So overall capitalization of the corporate parent enterprise value is lower than that. It's a higher share of equity than debt, but it's typically in the range of 50-50 at our utilities. And a strong investment grade credit rating we have now, and is an important priority for us and for our regulator.
Are the capital markets still supporting this kind of investment? I mean, they love data centers or not?
So the capital markets are supportive. We actually did a debt offering last week at Kansas Central, and it priced well. So it was priced at a nice tight band relative to the federal rate. So the capital markets are supportive because they know largely because as a regulated entity, you do have the backing of the model that you have. I think what our investors like to see is that we are approaching. It's important that you get the tariff right for the large new loads. So the market, if I ever speak to the equity markets, likes growth because they know that growth drives benefits generally for everyone. Describe it as a win-win-win. It's a win for existing customers. It's a win for the new customer. It's a win for the shareholder. So they're excited about growth as long as you get the rate right.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, I just wanted to say I think your wife and I could be very good friends because I've had the same rule about no talking shop at home, which has served us well, except now that my daughter's an engineer, that all went out the door, or out the window. So shop talk is allowed now. But no, I thank you for this information. And is there anything to be said as far as, I mean, obviously Texas has had some problems in terms of being able to control their rates and their situation. I mean, I guess are there lessons learned from what not to do in some respect?
So, and like I'm a proud Texan. I mean, I live up here now. I've lived here the last 5 years, but Senator Bowser also worked in the Texas market. I think what a deregulated market will have is more hills and valleys, or peaks and valleys. So I didn't even mention Texas on the average residential bill chart because they're suffering from the double whammy. They have high usage and high rates right now. So that's why they're by far the highest average monthly bill. If you look 7, 8 years ago, Texas looked really good because there was low natural gas prices, they had enough generation in the system, rates were lower. So it's just in the deregulated market, you're gonna have more variability for your customers, and at times like now, it's gonna spike, and that's great for you look at the Texas power companies, their share prices shot up in 2024. They're almost like high-tech companies, some of the highest performers, but that is because of a reflection of with so much demand, there's gonna be higher rates. So the deregulated model, happy to talk about that at length, having worked at it for earlier in my career, just has a lot more volatility to it, hills and valleys, which can be more difficult for customers because you don't have that predictable, steady piece. You can end up with some very high-cost years and some very good years, but it's harder to manage. And Uri, of course, by far the worst outage event in terms of system performance, because Uri hit a lot of the country, right, was in Texas. Sadly, it was 4 days where the system was out. If you don't have a regulated model, they're relying on the market, and the market didn't solve for that extreme weather pattern, for better or worse.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked about this being a win-win-win, so growth and investment. And yet when there was some talk about the, large tariffs, it was, how do we price that so we're covering the cost? How are you pricing that so it will lower rates across the board, as we've sort of been told would happen if usage increased?
So,
that's a hard one. I'll let Chuck cover that.
I eat, sleep, and dream this. So, look, at the end of the day, the biggest part about new growth and new customers that come in is they're going to cause us to build onto the system. And so when you look at those assets that we bring on, the rate has to reflect covering that part of the cost. What we call it is capital acceleration, because we accelerate how much capital we're investing and when. And we're actually going to put that as an explicit component in our large load power service tariff so that everybody can see how it's calculated and why it's there, which is to defray the cost of this incremental investment. Now, the great part of being a regulated utility is we propose it, and then a whole bunch of folks are going to argue over the details for 9 months in front of the commission. But ultimately, that's how we get to the right answer, because we'll balance interests and we'll look at it. I am not concerned at the end of the day that we will not be competitive at the end of this process. My assumption is that the rates that data centers in particular are likely to be charged will be slightly higher than our industrial rates today to reflect the significant investment that we are making on their behalf and what they bring to the system. If that's the case, and all of the other stakeholders, us and our regulators, are all incentivized to get this right, or it's not sustainable, then by virtue of the fact that you have more customers and a significant amount more usage utilizing essentially a very similarly sized grid, it will put downward pressure on rates.
And will this also flatten out the time of use? If we have data centers that are running 24/7?
It could have the effect of making the peaks smaller because you're going to be filling up the valleys. Now, here's the problem. The problem is they're going to run through those peaks too. So that green slide that I didn't cover very much, that has some things in there that says, look, if you can control your usage and use less in peaks or bring in your own generation that would, for example, solar, that would blunt the peaks, we'll compensate you for that because it's taking burden off of the grid.
And the only thing I'd add is just to note, the highest cost customers to serve are residential customers and small businesses typically because their volumes change radically with temperature. So you might have a household that's using, well, we all know from our bills, 2-3 times as much in the summer as the spring. So a large industrial customer, data center or a big manufacturing facility, it's one site, so you don't have all the distribution infrastructure, and it runs at a very consistent pattern. So they're actually once you have the infrastructure in place, they were a very relatively low cost profile to serve. So there's some benefits to those customers as well to have them in the mix.
I got a question or two. When you, number one, that you got 2 additional data centers in Missouri, it shows on page 25. Do we have any direct or indirect costs that would be on Kansas? You know, as you look at averaging, you're in both states. Is there anything that crosses over on that at all, Chuck?
Completely separate service territories.
All right.
And all kinds of interveners who watch that very carefully in our rate cases, as you would expect.
All right.
Inappropriately.
Sure. When you talked about the crown jewel, I can remember when everybody thought it was too high and it was a bad deal, and now look at it today. So I'm just wondering, back when that was built, and the regulations and the cost versus what regulations and costs are today, and with changes in Washington, you guys watching that very closely, as that might be something that would fit in the future, and small nuclear reactors? You might talk about both of them.
Sure. So I almost wanted to touch every piece of wood around me when Chuck was describing it that way, because I really hope that new nuclear, and I just talked about it, is going to be part of our future mix. So in the U.S., a wave of plants were built in the 70s and 80s. When 3 Mile Island occurred, a lot of the design specifications changed, and most of the plants that came online afterwards, including Wolf Creek, were way over their original budgets, 5-6 times over in some cases. So these plants were not viewed as crown jewels at that time. They were viewed as company destroyers and very unpopular. Now, those plants now are running. Many of them have passed their 40th anniversary. Some haven't reached them yet, but now they're viewed quite favorably because they've been very reliable. It's 20% of the power in Kansas. We've had 2 new nuclear units that have come online in the last 20 years, just 2. There were 2 units that were being built in South Carolina, and the company stopped about $2 to $3 billion in and actually sold the company because under the weight of it, because it was so far over budget. So those 2 units that came online in Georgia, they're very happy to have them now, but they cost about $30 billion together. So very expensive. So the answer to your question, building the nuclear the way we did in the past, we still don't have the cost model where it's affordable, where we would be actually asking for approval for it. It's too big a price tag. And we could drive that down over time, but it's still a really big number. So the promise now is, can we get the small modular reactors that you've probably read about to work? So they're not operating at scale today. There's one under construction in Wyoming that hopefully will come online in about 5 years. The Canadians, who were our very close friends, and now I'm not sure what to say, are building a few SMRs. We like seeing these get built because then you can get more certainty around how much they cost. Right now, the designs aren't certified and the supply chain doesn't exist, so we don't know how much they'd cost. And they typically will take at least 5 years to build once you've committed. So realistically, I think new nuclear is probably 10 years out. And we'll probably want to see, I would guess, 3 to 5 of them built before we would want to commit our company and our customers to that build out. But there's more enthusiasm for nuclear than I've seen. And what's different this time around is you see some of these very large tech companies getting behind it. And they have the balance sheets where if it goes $2 billion over, if you're a $1 trillion company, I mean, I don't really understand all that math. I don't operate in that stratosphere, but they may be able to stomach it more than the South Carolina utility that went $2 billion over and literally the CEO, CFO gone, and the company puts itself up for sale. It's not part of the Virginia utility. So I think we have backing for these and technology that's promising in ways that we can get into offline or have a special session. I really hope will work and it'll be part of the mix for us in the 20 to 30 year time frame. I'm sorry, the 10 to 30 year time frame, because we're going to, in that time frame, we'll have a lot of coal retiring.
Gentlemen, it's 2:30. We're supposed to be on the floor. Thank you for coming today very much. We enjoyed the presentation. So, committee, remember that to bring your confirmation packet with you tomorrow, because we'll have to turn that back in, and that's what's on the agenda for tomorrow. So with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.